Well, hey, church, as you have a seat, let me say welcome to 1128 Community. You've already met my wife, Colleen, this morning, and she told you that we lead the church together, and it's our hope that this will be a safe place for you today, that this will be a safe community for you to explore faith, relationship with Jesus, and what that might look like in your life. And it really is our desire that you would be able to do life different by setting rhythms and values with Jesus at the center. And today, we're continuing in this series called Anyone Out There. And we've been kind of looking at what it feels like sometimes to have hurt and pain in our lives. And we've been looking at the uncertainties of life. And maybe for you, like the last couple of days, you've felt like uncertain about things. It's felt like you're on shaky ground. And maybe there's like things that are hard. Maybe there's things that are just you're unsure, like if they're going to work out the way you'd hoped. Maybe the timing of it has changed. Maybe things are in flux. Maybe you're dealing with pain, physical, spiritual, emotional, mental pain even. Maybe you're dealing with loss or defeat here today. And my hope is that over the next little bit together, you would experience a little bit of hope, maybe a little bit of help you would find, and that there'd be healing that can be offered and start to work out in your life. Last week, we said that like when we hurt, we want to explain it away. And a lot of times we end up blaming people for why things happen the way they happen. And we said that blame, it may explain, but it's never going to heal. And we said that sometimes we got to take part in that. Jesus invites us, in fact, to take part in the healing process, to go to the pool and to wash so that our blindness would be wiped away. And this morning, we're going to continue talking about what it looks like to heal from pain. And specifically, we're going to talk about shame. And shame is one of those things that I've always had a hard time defining. But let me ask a question as we get started here this morning. When is the last time that you felt shame? Like, think about that for a moment. When's the last time that you felt shame? I feel pretty confident being able to ask that question because shame is universal. Whether we like it or not, we all experience shame at one point or another in our lives. It affects every single one of us, even those of you that are sitting here right now saying like, nah, doesn't get me. Like you have experienced shame in your life. It affects all of us, and it always has a negative impact in our lives when we experience shame. And if we're being completely honest, it sucks the joy out of us. The joy that we might have had about life when we experience shame, it's just zapped immediately. It goes away, and we're left feeling like, oh, this sucks. You know what I'm talking about. And maybe, though, you are still struggling like I do to define shame. And so here's the definition we're working with today. It's the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love or belonging. Let me ask you the question again. When's the last time that you felt shame? Does that come into mind? And maybe it's bringing back some like weird feelings right now. You're not the only one in the room feeling those things. The shame expert, and I mean like the shame expert. If you type into Google shame expert, the first name that will come up is Brene Brown. Dr. Brene Brown on her website describes herself this way. She says, I'm a researcher, a storyteller, and she is a Texan, which is good or bad, I don't really know. But she's a Texan who's spent the past 2 decades studying courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. And I personally will add, because she doesn't include this on her bio on her website, that she's written tons of books. She's spoken globally at conferences and small gatherings, and she's developed courses and trainings and online programs for us to become and learn how to be the healthiest version of ourselves. Brene Brown, she says there are 3 things about shame. The first thing she says is we all have it all. We all have shame. We all deal with shame. The second thing is that we're all afraid to talk about it. We're all afraid to talk about it. So we all have it, and then we're all afraid to talk about it. And the third thing is that the less we talk about it, the more it controls us. The less we talk about the shame that we feel, the more control it has over us, the more control it has over our lives, the way we interact with people, and how we operate. And so today, I want us to understand. I want us to believe this and just know this, that we are all on the same page this morning. We all deal with shame. And we all need help when it comes to healing from that. And you might know shame in your own life, right? Like as you process that question of when's the last time you've experienced shame, you might think about the time that you lost the job and then you had to go home and tell your family. You might think about being asked when you're due and you're not pregnant. You might feel like, I don't want people to know I'm an addict or I'm recovering. You might not want people to know that you scream at your children and you get so upset with them. You might feel shame because of bankruptcy or large debt or financial distress. You might feel shame because you're not awarded the promotion at work. Or maybe you didn't get that job that you really, really wanted. You might know shame as the experience of your partner leaving you. Whether it's expected or unexpected, there's still shame involved there. It might be the DUI, it might be infertility, it might be pornography, it might be failing classes, and maybe it's wondering if you're the only one that has parents that fight. Shame can also be, though, carrying a burden of something that's been done to you. You might be the victim of bullying, abuse, manipulation, or something worse. I want you to finish this thought in your head. My shame is. How do you fill in that blank? My shame is. Shame, it always brings suffering into our lives. It always brings hurt into our lives. But today, believe this. Shame is not of God. God is not the author or the creator of shame. God does not want you to feel shame or experience shame. God wants you to know healing, and today is about trusting that Jesus took on shame for the purpose of your healing. Jesus took on shame for the purpose of my healing. Jesus took on shame so that we all could experience healing and life. And so I want to jump into the book of Mark, and I want us to get into this interaction. It's a story that Mark is telling us about a time when he's walking through the city. He does a lot of walking through the city. Have you ever noticed that about Jesus? He's a walker. He had to get his steps in, I think. But Jesus is walking through the story or through the city, and this particular interaction, it happens in the middle of a bigger story. And so what's happening is Jesus is being asked by Jairus to come and heal his dying daughter. She's at home. Jairus is a religious leader, and so he's like kind of on the fence about Jesus. He's unsure, but he thinks like Jesus, the miracle worker, the one that I've heard about, like I'm going to ask him. It's kind of like a last resort thing. And so he comes to Jesus. Jesus says, like, okay, like, yeah, I'll come and see your daughter. Maybe he didn't say it like that. You know, maybe he had a little, like, yeah, I will come and see your daughter. Maybe it's an exciting moment. I don't really know, but he's on his way now to go and visit Jairus' home where his daughter is dying. And as he's on his way, a large crowd, we pick up the story, followed and pressed around him. a large crowd. Like, I don't know what a large crowd means, but I'm imagining a couple hundred people are like walking alongside Jesus. They're bumping shoulders, elbows, whatever. Like, there's people like pressed in these tiny city streets as they're leaving to go to the home of Jairus and to see and witness Jesus do a miracle. And so all these people are pressed around him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now, I'm not a woman, so I'm not qualified to talk on this at all, but from what I understand, that is a significant issue. That's a significant problem. She had suffered, we read from Mark, a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Like, she had tried to resolve this issue. She had tried to get her bleeding under control. She'd spent everything seeing doctors, people that could heal her. And yet, instead of getting better, she grew worse. Is that relatable for anybody here this morning? Like, maybe not specifically this, but like, you've spent a lot of money seeing people that can help you, only for your situation to not get any better, but to be worse. There's somebody here this morning that's feeling that. That's where this woman was. She had spent a lot of money looking to be healed. And instead of being healed, instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, right? And everybody's knowing about Jesus now. Like, there's a miracle worker. There's a guy that's healed people. He's made a blind man see. Like, there's this guy that he can make you better. When she heard about him, she came up behind him in the crowd and she touched his cloak. Now, remember, there's lots of people, like I said, maybe hundreds of people kind of crammed into this tiny space, and they're walking to this girl's home. So she had to like work her way through and kind of push and shove and like work her way through. And I'm sure everybody else, because she's like this woman that's had this problem, this situation of bleeding for 12 years, they're all like, oh, okay, like stay away from me. Like, you're unclean. I don't want to be by you. Like, she just touched me. She bumped me. Like, they're all feeling a thing. And this woman, she reaches out. She finally makes it, and she reaches out. And she touched his cloak because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. If I just touch his clothes. She had this thought in her mind that Jesus, the great healer, he can heal me without even seeing me or speaking to me. All I have to do is reach out and grab a small part. That's some faith right there. And here's what happened. Immediately, her bleeding stopped. 12 years of bleeding and one touch of the miracle worker's cloak, and it goes away. And she felt in her body that she was freed from suffering. She felt it, like it was gone in an instant. That moment of faith, that reaching out and touching the cloak, it took away years and years and years of pain and suffering. That's some crazy faith right there. That's the kind of faith that I think we all wish that we had. And if we're being honest, that's the kind of faith that we rarely step into. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He realized that something had happened. He knew it. He felt it. He turned around in the crowd, hundreds of people crammed in this little area as he was walking to see the dead girl, and he asked, "Who touched my clothes?" Maybe if you're a mom, you kind of relate with this. Like, you might have kids in like a group that like little ducks that follow behind you, and every once in a while you're like, "Who did that?" And they're like, "How'd you know?" Right? Like, dads, we're just like, "Y'all good back there?" But like moms are like, they got a different sense. Like, who did something? I know it. That's kind of what's going on here. Jesus is like, hey, who touched my clothes. He knew it. He felt the power leave him. And the people are crowding against him as disciples. They point out the obvious. They're like, you know, Jesus, there's a lot of people here in this area. They're kind of crowding around, a lot of people bumping you. And yet, how are you asking, who touched me? Jesus, you realize that's a ridiculous question, right? And I think, let's be honest here. We're all kind of the disciples. We're all thinking, how does he know that? That's a strange question when there's this many people around to just be who touched me? Could have been any number of people that touched him. The disciples are you and I. But Jesus, he doesn't even bat an eye at this ridiculous question, and he keeps looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, knowing that she had been healed, that this 12 years of suffering erased in an instant, she came and she fell at his feet, and trembling in fear. Can you imagine that? You're the one that reached out and touched the cloak of Jesus. You have experienced some sort of miraculous, deep healing. And here he is now wanting to know who did this. There's some sort of fear in her, and she's trembling. And she told him the whole truth. And I love what Jesus says to her. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Your faith, that little bit of faith to reach out and even just touch the corner of my cloak. That faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. I read it as be freed from your shame, right? Because we said shame always brings suffering. This woman had dealt with shame for 12 years of being this way. And Jesus freed her of that. He said, you are free. Be free of your suffering. Be free of your shame. Not only was this woman suffering physically, but she felt shame. She felt suffering emotionally, spiritually, mentally, socially, religiously, economically. She felt it all. Every area of her life she was suffering in because of this one thing. This thing that had been with her for 12 years. Something that she honestly had no control over. Something that she had tried to remedy. Something that she had tried to correct and asked others to help correct. She felt shame because of this, and she was cast aside. She was looked down upon. She was considered unclean. Some people saw her as sinful. She had no value in society because of this condition. That's a lot of suffering. That's a lot of shame to carry. And some of us here today are carrying similar amounts of shame and suffering on our shoulders. And for some of us, maybe it's been 12 years, maybe it's been 15, 20 years, or maybe it's just been the last little bit, the last couple days, the last month or two. And here's this woman in the presence of Jesus in a crowded street as this little note in a bigger story about him going to heal a girl that's dying. She thinks this is the moment that I have. And she reaches out in faith, believing that Jesus, the miracle worker, believing that Jesus, the healer, is able to heal her and free her of this pain and suffering. It's this moment of great vulnerability. And in that moment, Jesus doesn't say hey, I'm gonna shame you some more for being the way you are. He doesn't add any shame to her. He removes it. He says, go and be freed of that suffering. He tells her that her faith she had that day is what made her well. She became in that moment a living example to everybody else that was crowded into that little street. That Jesus is who he said he was, that Jesus takes away our shame and our suffering, and that burden is erased. is pretty miraculous. Peter notes this idea that Jesus comes to take away shame when he writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, the one who trusts in him, you and I, or maybe the woman that was bleeding for 12 years, the one who trusts in him will never be disgraced. That's the New Living Translation. The Message says, the one who trusts in him will never have cause to regret it. Or maybe you're an NIV person. The one who trusts in him will never be put to shame. This woman who reached out and touched the hem of his cloak, she wasn't labeled a disgrace. She had nothing to regret. The burden of shame and suffering was freed. Jesus didn't shame her or add anything onto her. Instead, he said, go in peace. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. You know, this is an example, this story of the ultimate ministry of Jesus, right? Like we know Jesus came and died and rose again so that we could be freed from our sins, so that our relationship with the Father could be restored, so that we might one day when we pass from this earth into the next life, like that we might experience heaven and be able to experience all that is. But Jesus doesn't want us to just get ready to die. Jesus wants us to really live. Jesus came so that we could be freed of our suffering today, so that we could be freed of our shame today. And I know that you've heard this before, but let me put it this way to you this morning. Jesus took on shame on the cross so that you could be healed. Jesus, the one who had nothing to regret because he lived a perfect life, took on shame so that you could be healed. Jesus, the one who had no reason to be labeled a disgrace, took on shame so that you could be healed. Jesus, who had nothing to be ashamed of, took on shame so that you could be healed. Have you ever thought through that? Have you ever thought through the cross and what that actually is? The cross, here's the thing about the cross. Like, it is intended to be the most shameful death one could experience. They wanted you, whoever it is that's putting you to death on the cross, they wanted you to not only experience physical suffering, but they wanted you to have this mental torture that goes along with it. They wanted you to be hung naked, right? Like, you never see Jesus naked on a cross in the pictures because artists take some liberties there and they cover him up. But like, you were naked on the cross in the center of the city for everybody to see it because they wanted you to be ashamed as you died a slow, painful death. They wanted you to be spit on, yelled at, cursed out, and told how awful you are. They wanted you, as you hung on the cross, naked and dying, to consider your guilt and to understand the shame as your body gave way. And here's the problem with this, though. Jesus had no guilt and he had no shame to consider as he hung on that cross. The only thing Jesus considered as he hung on the cross was me and you and all of us that live and breathe in this world. The only thing is, like, Jesus had no shame or guilt to take on for his own actions, and so he took on ours. He considered our shame, and he fulfilled the mission of removing that, taking away the suffering so that we might be healed. I said this earlier this morning as we got started. Shame is universal. And whether you believe me or not, you're welcome to think differently, but I'm telling you, like, this is true. And if you don't believe me right now, like, you'll experience it at some point and you will think it's true. Shame is universal. It did not leave anyone behind except for Jesus. And so I know this morning Whether we want to say yes, that we need healing from it or not, the reality is we all need healing from shame. The question is, though, are you willing to be brave and to do something uncomfortable? Do you have just a little bit of faith? Enough faith to reach out and grab that cloak? Do you trust that Jesus can heal you? Do you trust that reaching out and grabbing that cloak is all you got to do? Do you trust that Jesus took on your shame so that you can experience peace and freedom from suffering? Like, do you believe that? Do you believe that Jesus took on your shame for your healing? Do you believe that? Or do you just like the idea of a Jesus that died so that you can get into heaven? And you're okay living a shame-filled life of suffering each and every day? That sounds miserable. Jesus didn't die so that you can continue to suffer in this life. Jesus died so that you can experience healing and freedom and that you can go in peace. The work has already been done. It's kind of on you to reach out at this point, to do something bold, to do something crazy. This morning, we all have a step that we can take when it comes to healing from shame and suffering. If you haven't chosen before now to trust Jesus, that's the first step. You have to believe that Jesus died so that you can experience life with God, but also be freed from pain and suffering and shame today. You have to do that. If you haven't done that yet, nothing else is going to change. You have to believe and trust that Jesus knows you, sees you, loves you, died for you, forgives you, rose from the dead, and invites you to have a relationship each and every day with him. If you haven't chosen to trust Jesus yet, this is your step. This is your moment. I want to give you 60 seconds right now to have that conversation and to say, Jesus, I want to trust you. I want to start this process of healing. Take that 60 seconds right now. Jesus, there's some of us in this room that have never trusted you before. We like the idea of trusting you. We like the idea of doing life different. But when it comes down to it, we trust ourselves more than we trust others. Jesus, in this moment, we trust you. We reach out and we ask you to make us whole, make us better. Now, the hard part for all of us this morning is that there is something beyond just that first step. It's agreeing to do something uncomfortable. It is reaching out in a crowded place and admitting maybe that you experience shame, that you deal with suffering in your life. And I don't want us to do something where we all have to stand up and be like, hey, I feel shame about this. Like, we're not going to have that moment of confession or confiding here in this space. But what I do want to do is I want to invite you to participate in a 5-day devotional that's going to encourage you you and cause you to reflect on who Jesus is, what shame is, how it affects you, and how you might be healed from it. So here's what we're going to do. We're all going to do it because shame is universal. We're all going to get out our phones right now. So get them out. Grab them out of your pocket, pick them up off the ground. This is okay. Like, you can get your phone out at this point. I appreciate that they've been away the whole entire morning until now, but get out your phone and you're going to type in the number 414-441-1128. That's our 1128 number. You're going to send a message to that number, and you're just going to type in the word shame. And over the next 5 days, starting tomorrow, you're going to get an email at 6 a.m. with a key verse, something to think about, something to practice, and a prayer to pray. And after these 5 days, my hope is that you have experienced a little bit of healing, that you have connected more deeply with Jesus, and that Jesus, you hear him saying to you, go in peace and be freed from your suffering. That's my hope. But you got to do something that feels uncomfortable if you're going to experience the healing that Jesus has to offer you. We said it at the beginning, and I'm going to say it again. Shame is universal. Shame leaves no one behind, and this is your way today by texting this number, texting the word shame to that number, of doing something bold and courageous. This is your reach out and grab the cloak moment. This is your way of saying, Jesus, I believe even with the tiniest bit of faith that you have something better for me. I know Jesus has something better for each and every one of us because Jesus came, he took on shame on the cross with the purpose of your healing in mind. And so today, as we wrap up, know that Jesus wants you to be healed of suffering. He wants you to experience freedom and real living. Let me pray over us, then we'll wrap up with a song. Jesus, thank you for going to the most shameful place imaginable. Thank you for going to the cross, for dying there, for taking on guilt and shame and things that you had no reason to take on other than for our healing. God, as we step into these uncomfortable moments over the next 5 days, would you meet us there? Would you change us? Would you free us? Would we know peace beyond any peace we've known before? We pray this all in your healing, transformative name. Amen.